Yes, we have, yeah. Roger tells me I'm not allowed to start until 1 o'clock. I always do what I'm told.
Means I can come around and get a little slideshow if you like.
Oh dear.
I'll be efficient.
Pretty much any time from now on is fine.
That's 1 minute
I
early.
know. Dangerous.
Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, ko karam hotasia ho. Welcome. I want to start this press conference with one of the whakatauki offered by Sir John Clarke. Ahakoa iti he mapihi pounamu. Even though it is small, it has its own mana, and it is precious. That is Malachi. You have my report, and I'll respond to questions, but first I have a few introductory comments to make. The chief executives of 6 government departments commissioned me to undertake an independent review to examine and identify ways to improve the children's sector identification of and response to abuse of children and young persons. My focus is not to look at individual agencies, but on looking across the whole system for where improvements can be made. The circumstances of Malachi Subecz's abuse and death are a tragedy. Malachi's mother and family have shared their grief with us in order that such a tragedy might not befall another child. In my meetings with a range of people and organisations, I heard the words, "Do not look away," and that applies to us all. I have identified 5 critical gaps and made 14 recommendations to address those gaps. I have likened my recommendations to a children's climbing frame with layers of safety nets so that if a child falls through the first safety net, they are caught by the second safety net. A system of mutually reinforcing, purposefully constructed and hardwired safety nets is essential to offering the protection and care that tamariki, like Malachi, are owed. I have endeavoured to ensure a child at risk of abuse is not invisible. This leads me ultimately to a recommendation that New Zealand adopts a requirement of mandatory reporting of suspected abuse. Professionals and others who work with children should become mandatory reporters. This removes the uncertainty that I had expressed to me as to whether, when, and how to report significant risk of harm. The needs of children have to be paramount, and there should be no choice about that reporting. Along with mandatory reporters, there should be a mandatory reporting guide with clear definitions of what constitutes red flags and regular training required so that all who work with children know how to carry out their obligations. The other gaps I have identified relate to the need for oranga tamariki to be formally tasked to have eyes on the child when a sole parent is arrested or remanded to prison. For agencies to think more broadly about red flags that might signal a risk to a child. For agencies and their services to join together, as sometimes happens at the moment, in multi-agency, on-the-ground groups working in partnership with iwi, kaupapa Māori organisations and NGOs to support whānau and share information. These developments help knit services together with children at risk of abuse as the focus. This helps address the problem identified by Laurie O'Reilly, a former Commissioner for Children, that everyone has part of the jigsaw puzzle, but no one has the full picture. Finally, I repeat my finding that Malachi became an invisible child within the system because there were those who tried to act but were not listened to. There were those who were uncertain and did not act. There were those who knew and chose not to act. This is not acceptable, and we cannot look away. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Pātai, questions?
As you point out in your report, these are not new recommendations. We've had report after report after report. What confidence do you have that you can actually change?
I do have confidence that we can achieve change. I do agree with you, and I've referenced the fact that it's a sad litany of past reports that we've got behind us, and we have to look to a future where we improve on that. I do think the time is right for some of the changes that I've recommended that perhaps weren't able to be implemented before. So we might talk about mandatory reporting in a little while. But the other thing that gives me confidence is those on-the-ground collaboratives that are working in a multi-agency fashion together with iwi, kaupapa Māori and NGOs. They cover about a third of the country at the moment, and they are very effective in working together and sharing information because that's where it comes together on the ground.
In this case, Oranga Tamariki did refer to an iwi-based organisation, and that report was closed.
I'm not confident that your first statement is correct, but it is true to say that in this instance there was not an opportunity for Malachi's family to be addressed within the context of an on-the-ground multi-agency group. That's correct. So the multi-agency groups are a very positive opportunity for New Zealand as a whole. Some of you may well have visited some of them, and they are a really good interagency, and not just agencies, but with NGOs and kaupapa Māori on the ground. They can work with families to detect risk in a way that others can't.
There have been criticisms of mandatory reporting in the past that it doesn't work out so well. Can you say why do you think this is the best case now?
You're correct in that we have considered mandatory reporting at least twice, quite seriously, in New Zealand. The concerns at the time were that there may be over-reporting and that might produce more problems than is being solved. However, in talking with New South Wales and Victoria, both of whom have had mandatory reporting for a significant period of time, I am confident that that risk can be managed, and that risk is managed by the package that you put around mandatory reporting, being very clear about the criteria for significant risk, having support and training, and being able to be clear about who are mandatory reporters. Victoria has a similar system to what New Zealand has in the way of on-the-ground support, because having that on-the-ground support makes mandatory reporting a lot more doable now, because that enables a wraparound for families where children are at risk and provides support for families. So the two are complementary.
You said that Malachi became an invisible child within the system for the reasons that you said. Those who tried to act were not listened to, those who were uncertain did not act, and those who knew chose not to act. Was Malachi failed by the system?
Malachi was failed by the system, and that's why I've identified 5 key gaps that need to be addressed to ensure that we have overlapping safety nets. So I'm looking for overlapping hardwired safety nets so that children don't fall between those. Because remember, the risk of abuse is often hidden. Therefore, we have to be very, very alert for where there is a high risk of abuse and look further than the adults in front of us. We have to focus on the risk to the child.
So you've found 5 key gaps and made 14 recommendations of that. How urgently do these recommendations need to be put in place?
There will be an order within which they can be addressed. Some will be able to be addressed by agencies almost immediately. Others will take longer, and of course legislative change will take longer still. But if we are working towards that package of change, and if people are alert to what we are trying to do with regards to interlocking safety nets, then that will help us while we are putting in place the recommendations.
So Carmen Davis has said that they're going to be accepting 9 of the recommendations, and that 5 they're committing to looking at that. But those 5 are 2 of your key ones, which are mandatory reporting and the vetting of caregivers by OTA. So is that good enough?
It's really important that we look at each of the recommendations because they do stack together as a package. We will not be able to do them all at once. You'll be very aware of mandatory reporting will require a parliamentary process and needs to be looked at very carefully. The nuts and bolts of implementation that give me my secure, hardwired safety nets will take some time to look at and do properly because there's a lot of consultation that needs to occur with the professionals who will be mandatory reporters and with the service providers. That time taken is time well spent because it is reminding people about what they need to do, and it's seeking input into how you would construct what constitutes a high risk of abuse. So that is time well spent. That does not trouble me, as long as we're on a pathway to securing those interlocking safety nets.
So what do you say perhaps to those families who want, the recommendations implemented almost immediately, or certainly they're kind of tired of waiting? What do you say to that kind of criticism?
I understand people are tired of waiting. We have a very bad history in New Zealand of child abuse. However, there are some things we can do smartly. There are other things that we do need to take time to do properly. And so it is important that we take time to do them properly. But the answer to those who are worried about us not being able to wave a magic wand and do it right now, believe you me, I'm sure if somebody could have done that, they would have, is that by focusing our attention on this, that reduces risk while we've got attention focused.
But given the litany of failures, I mean, ultimately, do you have confidence, just reiterating the point there, do you have confidence that these agencies will be able to pull off the recommendations?
I do have confidence that the agencies will be able to implement the recommendations. There are a lot of good people working in a lot of good agencies. There's a fundamental basis for us to build on and go forward. And the important thing right now is that in New Zealand we've got more tools to be able to do this than we've had in the past. So you'll be aware of the agencies being responsible, what we call vertical accountability for what they do, and that's appropriate. But what we're looking for here is the horizontal responsibility for a child at risk. And we're able to do that a lot better now than we could many years ago. So we have a new Public Service Act that is enabling of agencies working together in a constructive fashion.
So this sense of invisibility that you've mentioned, I mean, can we say, in years' time that perhaps that's gone from the system? And would you be able to speculate on that?
I would hope we could, and you'll see my recommendations do have a review put into the recommendations that in a year's time we should look and see how far we've progressed, because there should be no invisible child. No child should be invisible to the system when they are in high need.
In the media statement you provided, it says that over the past 30 years, many of the recommendations in your report have been made by other inquiries into the tragic deaths of children. How likely is it, do you think, that the changes that you've recommended will actually be implemented now, given we've had similar recommendations over the past 30 years?
I'm confident they will be, and I'm confident this is a moment in time when we can grasp up the need for agencies to be working very closely together so that there are no gaps through which children can fall. And I think this is the right time to have that expectation.
When the Ombudsman did his review, he said that OT would not forthcoming with information. It was very difficult for him to work with Malachi. What was your experience in working with these government agencies?
My experience was entirely positive. The Chief Executives commissioned me, so my report is to the Chief Executives. So that's point number one. They wanted to look at what were the gaps that occurred for Malachi that need to be addressed so that they don't occur for another child. So that's a very important point to note. This is a report that's been commissioned by 6 Chief Executives. The second point is that I received every support that I asked for, and that Chief Executives and their staff were entirely positive and open. Everybody wants to do this well. Nobody wants children falling between the gaps that I've identified. And so everybody does want to see those gaps met and hardwired protections put in.
And what about you personally? What was the impact of doing this report?
It was tough. I've worked in health, as you know, and education. I've not worked in the children's sector per se. But reading, as you will, when you read the report, reading the agency's reports, talking with Malachi's mother and his family, that was shattering for anybody to look at. And it's been a shattering environment for the family and for Malachi's mother. Nobody would want any mother or family to have to go through this. And so we have to treat this seriously. And you see me emphasising, don't look away. That was said to me by an organisation that I was meeting with. And I think it's a very good message for New Zealand. You know, we should not look away. We cannot tolerate this. We do not have a good record as a society. And it is a message for us all.
You mentioned a lot about Malachi's mother in this report. What's your message to her today?
That we have listened to what she and her family have said, that we have thought hard about how we can put protections in to prevent a tragedy like Malachi's death happening again.
And due to the gaps identified in the system, do we have any sense of how many more children there could be out there being consistently abused that we don't yet know about?
That's a very good question. And no, we don't, but we know that abuse is hidden. And therefore, we owe it to children to have a high index of suspicion. And we have to look beyond the narrow engagement that we might be having with an adult, albeit meeting the adult's needs, and be aware of where there might be high risk to a child, because we don't know. And that is why defining what constitutes high risk and then acting on that, and not allowing a do I or don't I, or, you know, that children are owed more than that. If they are at risk, there needs to be mandatory reporting.
Can you explain, when you did your report, you included some mentions of what the community, of his interactions not only with agencies but with the community, Michaela Barable's whānau, other people who saw it. Why did you find that was an important thing to include?
The statement of don't look away is a really, really important statement. I think people want to think the best, and they don't want to think a child is being abused. But if there is evidence of abuse, we cannot look away. And so that's a message for everybody, and I think we do need to, as a society, focus on that.
You're encouraging partnership with these organisations. You're not going as far as to recommend devolution of resources to them. Why not, if they've got that holistic wraparound approach?
The holistic wraparound approach is extremely important, and I am recommending that that's resourced and sustainably resourced. Because if you're talking with Strengthening Families initiatives on the ground, for argument's sake, there's a lot of different forms this can take, but they are committed and they are working and they need to be resourced sustainably so that they can have best effect on the ground.
Because this would represent a huge increase in the amount of money involved, wouldn't it? And they're already struggling with resources to do the job they have.
Resourcing is tight, and if we're going to make progress here, we do have to sustainably resource, remembering that if we do this well, then ultimately other sorts of resources will not be necessary. So if we do this well and we train and support our frontline staff, and they are working in partnership with iwi agencies, NGOs on the ground, then the results are going to be significantly different, and that is going to have a positive impact.
There have been calls to dismantle Oranga Tamariki. What do you think about that, and from your work, putting this report together, do you have faith in Oranga Tamariki as an institution to make the changes needed?
Yeah, my report is not about any one agency. It's about how agencies work together, and it has the child at the focus. And I am confident that all agencies want to get this right. And so my piece is it's not one agency, it's a system review, it's about the system as a whole, and we've got to look broadly. And Oranga Tamariki has a key role to play in that system.
There's been some criticism of Oranga Tamariki as not having made the changes from the old system into the new one. So, yeah, I guess, I mean, it sounds like you can't speak specifically to it, but do you have faith that they're capable of the systemic change that's needed?
I'm confident in all the agencies and their ability to do this differently and to work together. And you're probably aware of some of the, and I've mentioned them in my report, some of the work that's already been done collaboratively by the agencies to think about how they work together. And that's absolutely critical if we're going to have a fail-safe system that actually addresses those gaps. It's agencies working together. And I'm confident all our agencies can do that.
We touched on mandatory reporting before. I mean, distrust of Oranga Tamariki and other agencies is given as a reason for people not reporting abuse. What is your recommendation to counter that?
Mandatory reporting does require trust. You're absolutely right. And on the on-the-ground, multi-agency, collaborative, and that's where trust is built because people are working together. So Oranga Tamariki's working with health, working with police, working with families, working with iwi. That's where trust is built on the ground. And that will help us with mandatory reporting. The other side of mandatory reporting is that if it is mandatory, then you don't have to consider whether it's a good thing to be doing or not. It is something that you must do in order to protect the child. And if we have the child, if we have the tamariki at the centre, then the rest flows naturally.
Would Malachi still be here if more recommendations had been in place two or 3 years ago?
My recommendations are designed to ensure that no child like Malachi endures the abuse that he endured. That's what we can say, that if we put in place mechanisms to protect those gaps and to ensure that we've got mutually reinforcing safety nets, then we provide more protection. That's what we can say.
Will there be, have you thought about unintended consequences, like maybe more uplifts, maybe that sort of thing happening, more reporting happening?
There are always unintended consequences, positive and negative, when you make a new step into the future. But this has been well thought about before. The Australian experience is a good experience. And for us in New Zealand, I believe this is the time to put aside the anxiety about it and say, what we've got is not good enough. We should be taking this extra step.
You have, you've said a lot of things in this report, and one thing that sticks out to me is that you said, I find it unacceptable that I need to once again make similar findings about how the system is or is not interacting. And you mentioned before that the system had failed Malachi.
Yes.
What is your message to those who owe it to Malachi to make this a catalyst for change?
We have a duty to care, and we have a duty to care for a child at risk of abuse, and we have to focus on that child. That doesn't mean to say that we're not focused on the individual transaction that we might be doing as an agency in whatever we're tasked with doing. But we have to think more broadly. We have to consider that there may be a child sitting behind the adult, and that there is, because abuse is hidden, we have to be very alert to red flags. And there are several red flags that I've highlighted in my report. Focusing on those red flags means that you will focus on Malachi or on a child in an at-risk situation like Malachi.
And you keep saying that the overall message here is that we cannot look away. Who are you directing that message to?
I'm directing that to all of us, New Zealand society, and to all our agencies, and in particular to those who are working within the children's sector.
About 9 of the 14 recommendations that you've made have been accepted by Tamariki. But, you know, what do you say to the rest of them? I know they cite that they need more information next year, but it must be just frustrating.
The acceptance of 9 recommendations is good. The working on the more complicated ones is good. And I think that's what we have to hold clear, that if it were easy, it would have been done yesterday. Absolutely. Everybody wants this to work. Everybody wants to protect our children. It is complicated, but that's not an excuse for not doing anything. So we've done with excuses. We've got to look at how we do this. And for some of the recommendations, I fully expect that will take some time to do properly, because we have to, it is the nuts and bolts piece. I have not done the nuts and bolts. I have said I want interlocking safety nets. The nuts and bolts have to be carefully worked out so that the system will be effective.
You've said that the majority of these recommendations are not new, and that for the past 30 years, many of these recommendations in your report have been made by other inquiries into tragic deaths of children. So, isn't this something that should have happened a long time ago? Shouldn't these recommendations have been implemented a long time ago?
We would all want these recommendations to have been implemented a long time ago. What I think we have now is an opportunity, because of where we are at the moment, of being able to put enduring changes in place that do fill those gaps. And what is different now is that we've got much better opportunity for agencies to work together. We understand that it can't be one agency on its own. So by getting agencies working together, by agencies themselves wanting to work together, and by there being mechanisms for horizontal responsibility, that's what we've got available to us today that we may not have had years ago.
But realistically, though, you just said that, you know, for enduring change it's going to take a while, and we still don't know how many invisible kids there are out there, as you said before. How long is it actually going to take to, in your opinion, to see some real change here?
I think we've already seen some real change for a start, because as I've been working on my system-wide approach, agencies have been looking at their own approach and have been looking intensively there. So some change has already occurred. Some change will happen in the next 6 months. I firmly believe that. And other more complicated change will be done properly in a longer period. But I am confident that by making us all focus, Malachi's death means that we will be putting in place a greater alert system right now for what constitutes red flags of abuse.
And lastly, how important is it to you that Malachi doesn't just become another report that some recommendations are made of?
Totally important. I've worked in this system, as you all know, for some time. This is critical for New Zealand. If we can't get this right, then we have failed. That seems an appropriate time, doesn't it? Yes. And you've all naturally paused at the time where some of you will be wanting to go to the Minister's press conference, I know. So, no, thank you. Yeah, oh yes, you're going as well.
Yes, and I'll call you
Yeah.
after that and we can have a discussion.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Good questions. Ditto. Good questions.
Has the, I assume the family's already seen the report.
Yes. Yes, of course. Yeah. You can't do this work without the family so thoroughly engaged. And, they've been tremendous, really. Really tough for them. No, they couldn't have. I hope I've signalled that.